A parking lot camera captured the one thing investigators needed most. A human being, in daylight, on video, at the exact moment a young woman's life was ending. And it still wasn't enough. The footage exists. It has existed for almost 20 years. Detectives have watched it thousands of times. The FBI enhanced it. NASA enhanced it. And to this day, nobody can tell you if the person walking away from that car is a man or a woman. This is the story of Jennifer Kesse, a 24-year-old finance manager who vanished from her own front door in Orlando, Florida, in January 2006. Her car turned up a mile away. Her cell phone, her purse, her keys, and the clothes she wore that morning were never found. And the only image of the person responsible is obscured almost perfectly by a fence. Some call it the worst luck in the history of missing persons cases. Others aren't so sure it was luck at all. Jennifer Joyce Kesse was born on May 20th, 1981, in New Jersey and was raised in Florida. She graduated from Gaither High School in Tampa before enrolling at the University of Central Florida, where she earned a finance degree in 2003. By early 2006, Jennifer had built exactly the kind of life a driven 24-year-old dreams about. She worked as a finance manager for Central Florida Investments, a major timeshare company based in Ocoee, just outside Orlando. She had recently purchased her own condominium, a milestone she was proud of. She was close with her parents, Drew and Joyce Kesse, and with her brother. And she was in a serious relationship with her boyfriend, Rob Allen, a man she'd met a year earlier at a bar in Orlando. Despite the distance, he lived in Fort Lauderdale, more than 3 hours away. The two had built a steady, long-distance relationship. Friends and family described Jennifer as safety-conscious almost to a fault. She always called someone while walking from her office to her car. She noticed her surroundings. Her condominium complex was in the middle of a major renovation at the time, and construction crews were on site daily. Jennifer had mentioned to her family more than once that some of the workers would whistle and catcall her as she came and went. It unsettled her enough that she brought it up repeatedly, a detail that would take on new weight in the days that followed. None of this, the caution, the awareness, the instinct to stay safe, would matter. Because whatever came for Jennifer Kesse came fast, and it came from somewhere she never saw. The weekend before she disappeared, Jennifer and Rob took a trip together to St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a romantic getaway, the kind of trip that suggested a relationship moving forward, not one about to be violently interrupted. They flew back into Florida on Sunday, January 22nd. Jennifer spent that night at Rob's home in Fort Lauderdale, then drove straight to Orlando the next morning, Monday, January 23rd, to be back at work. Monday unfolded like any other workday. Jennifer left her office at Central Florida Investments around 6 p.m. On her drive home, she called her parents. A routine check-in, nothing out of the ordinary. It was the last time her family would ever hear her voice. She arrived at her condo that evening, the first time she'd been back since leaving for vacation. At around 10 p.m., she spoke by phone with Rob. They said goodnight. He was the last person known to have spoken with her. Investigators would later piece together from the physical evidence inside her apartment exactly what Jennifer did after that call. A towel, still damp. Clothes laid out for the next day. The unmistakable signs of a woman getting ready for an ordinary Tuesday morning at work. She had no idea it would be her last one. Jennifer had a habit, one so consistent that its absence would become one of the most important details in the entire case. Every morning before leaving for work, she called or texted Rob. On the morning of Tuesday, January 24th, 2006, that call never came. Between roughly 8 o'clock and 9 a.m., Rob tried reaching her on his own way to work. The call went straight to voicemail. He assumed she was in a meeting she'd mentioned. He tried again. Same result. At the office, Jennifer's absence didn't go unnoticed for long. She was reliable, the kind of employee who simply didn't miss work without calling in. When she failed to show up and failed to answer any calls, her employer contacted her parents directly around 11 a.m. Drew and Joyce Kesse were 2 hours away in Tampa. They immediately began the drive to Orlando. On the way, they called the manager of Jennifer's condominium complex and asked him to let himself into her unit with a spare key to check on her. What he found, and more importantly, what he didn't find, became the first real signal that something was catastrophically wrong. Everything inside the apartment looked untouched. No struggle, no sign of forced entry. But Jennifer's car was gone from its parking spot. By 3 p.m., Jennifer's parents and brother had arrived at the condo themselves. They confirmed what the property manager had already reported: the towel, the laid-out clothes, all the small proof that she had been home and getting ready that morning. And then, nothing. No purse, no phone, no keys, no Jennifer. They called the police. Because Jennifer Kesse was a legal adult with no history of erratic behavior, Orlando police initially treated the case with caution, leaving open the possibility that she had simply left on her own. It's a standard, almost procedural first step in adult missing persons cases. But for a family staring at a spotless apartment and a missing daughter, it was maddening. By early evening, friends and family were already blanketing the neighborhood with flyers. The Orlando Police Department deployed search teams on foot, on horseback, by boat, by helicopter, and by ATV. Within days, the search would grow to more than 1,400 volunteers combing the area around her home. Nobody found Jennifer. But 2 days later, they found her car. On the morning of Thursday, January 26th, a resident of a nearby apartment complex was watching the local news, saw a description of Jennifer's black 2004 Chevrolet Malibu, and realized they'd been looking at it for days. The car had been sitting, untouched, in the parking lot of their complex, just 1.2 miles from Jennifer's own home, since Tuesday. Police confirmed it was her vehicle and immediately began a forensic sweep. Then someone on the investigative team remembered something that would change the entire trajectory of the case. That apartment complex had security cameras covering its parking lot. Detectives pulled the footage. What they found, time-stamped at almost exactly 12 p.m. on Tuesday, January 24th, mere hours after Jennifer had vanished, was a person parking her Malibu and calmly walking away. It should have been the case-breaking moment. Instead, it became the case's most agonizing detail. The parking lot's chain-link fencing cut directly across the camera's field of view, slicing through the frame at the exact angle needed to obscure the person's face. The footage itself was low resolution, recorded in choppy intervals rather than smooth video. No distinguishing tattoos, no clear clothing brand, no readable face, just a shape, a walk, and roughly 30 seconds of a person sitting inside the car before stepping out. The FBI was brought in to analyze the recording. Their conclusion was frustratingly narrow. The individual stood somewhere between 5 feet 3 inches and 5 feet 5 inches tall, and appeared to be wearing clothing similar to a painter's or construction worker's uniform. Even NASA was consulted to help enhance the image. To this day, investigators have never been able to determine whether the person in that footage is male or female. A police dog was brought to the scene and given Jennifer's scent. The dog tracked a trail leading from the abandoned car back in the direction of her own condominium complex, suggesting, chillingly, that whoever dropped off the Malibu may have doubled back toward her home on foot. No further physical evidence was found along that route. Forensic examiners went over the Malibu itself. The interior yielded almost nothing. A single latent fingerprint and a trace amount of DNA, later described as coming from a small fiber. Investigators concluded the vehicle had likely been wiped down. Whoever left it there had been careful. And what wasn't in that car told its own story. Jennifer's valuables, her purse, her briefcase, her phone, her iPod, her keys, and the outfit she'd been wearing that morning were all missing, ruling out robbery as a plausible motive. Her cell phone was never powered on again. Her bank card was never used again. Whoever took Jennifer Kesse didn't want her things. They wanted her. As is standard in any disappearance investigation, detectives began close to home. Jennifer's boyfriend, Rob Allen, the last person to speak with her, was interviewed extensively and ultimately eliminated as a suspect. His own account of that morning didn't fit the window in which Jennifer vanished. An ex-boyfriend described as someone who had recently expressed a desire to reconcile with Jennifer was also brought in for questioning. He too was cleared. Investigators then turned to Jennifer's workplace. A forensic review of her office computer revealed that a manager at Central Florida Investments had expressed romantic interest in her, interest Jennifer had firmly declined, citing her own policy against workplace relationships. Detectives interviewed him multiple times. He was eventually ruled out as well. Then there was the condominium complex itself, mid-renovation, crawling daily with construction workers, many of them non-English speaking, according to investigators. Jennifer had complained to her family about being catcalled and whistled at by some of these workers in the weeks before she disappeared. It was a detail that seemed significant, but language barriers made a full, thorough interview process with every worker on that site extraordinarily difficult, and police were never able to develop a solid lead from that avenue. It remains one of the case's most persistent open threads. Family, friends, co-workers, an ex, a boyfriend, a manager, a construction crew. One by one, the obvious answers evaporated. Nearly 2 decades later, no one has ever been arrested. No one has ever been formally named a suspect in open court. The most damning piece of evidence in the entire case remains that 30 seconds of blurred footage and a person walking away from a parked car in broad daylight, unbothered, unhurried, and unidentified. What followed Jennifer's disappearance was not a quiet, forgotten case. It became one of the most publicized missing persons investigations in Florida history, driven in enormous part by the relentless advocacy of her parents. Drew and Joyce Kesse turned their grief into a campaign. They gave interviews. They built a website. They hired private investigators. They appeared year after year at press conferences and on national television, refusing to let their daughter's story fade into a filing cabinet. In May 2007, David Siegel, the head of Jennifer's company, offered a $1 million reward for information leading to her whereabouts, provided she was found alive by a July 4th deadline. It went unclaimed. A separate $5,000 reward through Central Florida Crime Line, tied to locating her remains, also produced nothing. The case's national profile grew large enough that it changed Florida law. On May 2, 2008, the Florida House of Representatives unanimously passed the Jennifer Kesse and Tiffany Sessions Missing Persons Act, legislation named for 2 young women who vanished under eerily similar unresolved circumstances, designed to reform how the state handles missing persons cases going forward. In 2010, then Orlando Police Chief Val Demings personally urged the FBI to take over the investigation, a request that was granted. Federal resources joined a case that state and local police had already spent years working without a resolution. Still, nothing. By 2018, Jennifer's parents had grown frustrated with what they felt was a lack of transparency from the department that had led the investigation for over a decade. They filed a lawsuit against the Orlando Police Department, demanding access to the full case file. The suit was settled in March 2019. As part of that settlement, the Kesse family was granted access to more than 16,000 pages of investigative records, files that had, until that point, remained entirely out of their reach. What they found in those pages has never been fully disclosed to the public, but in November 2020, newly released police photos reportedly suggested evidence of a violent struggle, details that had not previously been made widely known, and which reframed public understanding of just how much force may have been involved in Jennifer's abduction. In December 2022, the case took another turn. The investigation was formally handed over to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's Cold Case Unit. It was, in some ways, an admission, nearly 17 years after Jennifer vanished. The case needed fresh eyes, fresh resources, and modern forensic tools that simply didn't exist back in 2006. For most of 2 decades, the Kesse family lived through a punishing cycle, hope followed by silence, leads followed by dead ends. Then, in the spring and fall of 2025, that cycle finally seemed to break. On May 20, 2025, Jennifer's 44th birthday, the FDLE announced a significant update. Investigators revealed they had combed through thousands of pages of documentation and interviewed approximately 45 people since taking over the case in December 2022. For the first time, officials stated publicly that they had identified several persons of interest and that the case was no longer being treated as cold. Perhaps most striking, investigators revealed they were exploring whether modern artificial intelligence tools could succeed, where 2006-era forensic technology, the FBI's manual analysis, and even NASA's involvement had failed, potentially identifying the person captured on that infamous parking lot footage nearly 20 years after the fact. Then, in October 2025, came the development the family had waited 2 decades to hear. Drew Kesse announced that FDLE agents had informed him and his wife that they had found DNA evidence within case materials that had never previously been tested. This directly contradicted an earlier statement from the Orlando Police Department, which had claimed that DNA evidence had only ever been recovered from the vehicle's steering wheel. According to Drew Kesse, the pool of persons of interest had been greatly reduced, and the family now believed they had a better chance of finding answers than at any point in the previous 19 years. That same month, Drew Kesse also revealed that a documentary team was developing a television series about Jennifer's case, expected for release in early 2026, a sign that after almost 20 years, public interest, investigative pressure, and forensic technology may finally be converging at the right moment. Nearly 20 years later, The core mystery of Jennifer Kesse's disappearance remains unsolved, and it raises questions that no amount of technology has yet been able to fully answer. How was a 24-year-old woman, cautious by nature and safety-conscious in her daily habits, abducted from her own condominium complex or somewhere along her short morning commute without a single witness coming forward in almost 2 decades? Why would her abductor risk driving her stolen car to a different apartment complex, park it in direct view of a security camera, and walk away on foot in broad daylight, rather than abandoning it somewhere less exposed? Was the person in that footage male or female? A stranger, or someone from Jennifer's own daily orbit? A face she might have recognized in the moment before everything went wrong? And why, despite a $1 million reward, an FBI task force, a change in state law, and now advanced forensic retesting, has no single piece of evidence ever definitively closed the case? The DNA breakthrough announced in October 2025 offers the clearest hope in years. But hope, in the Kesse case, has a long and difficult history. The family has believed they were close before. There is a particular cruelty in cases like this one, cases without a body, without a confession, without a trial. Jennifer's parents have spent nearly 20 years unable to bury their daughter, unable to hold a funeral with any finality, unable to stop wondering whether the phone might ring tomorrow with the answer they've waited 2 decades to hear. Drew and Joyce Kesse never stopped searching. They turned unbearable grief into advocacy that reshaped Florida law for other families who may one day walk the same road they did. They kept Jennifer's name in the headlines not because they wanted attention, but because they understood instinctively that cases go cold the moment the world stops asking questions. Jennifer Kesse was 24 years old. She had just returned from a vacation with the man she loved. She had a new condo, a career she'd worked hard to build, and a morning routine so precise that its one deviation became the loudest clue in the entire case. Somewhere, a piece of security camera footage still exists, 30 seconds long, time-stamped at noon on January 24, 2006, showing the last confirmed human contact anyone has ever had with whatever happened to Jennifer that day. A fence obscures the face. Time has blurred the resolution, but the questions it raised have never gone away. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Jennifer Kesse, you're encouraged to contact the Florida Department of Law Enforcement or the FBI's Tampa field office. Jennifer Kesse remains missing. And somewhere, that footage is still waiting to give up its secret.